Welcome to Finscale, a podcast created by Solène Niederkorn, shedding light on innovation in finance, banking, and insurance.
Pioneering carbon removal with Frontier. Nan Ransohoff, Head of Climate at Stripe.
There are two main levers that we can pull. We can stop emitting in the first place, often called emissions reduction, or two, we can pull CO2 already in the atmosphere and ocean and store that somewhere permanently. The world is going to need to do a huge amount of both. Roughly the split, 90% of the effort should focus on emissions reduction. We will not solve climate change without attention on this piece. But because of the sort of, we've waited so long and because certain industries are quite hard to decarbonize, we will also, in addition to emissions reduction, need to do a lot of carbon removal.
It's been a long time since I had in mind to have Stripe on Finscale, but I wanted to cover a topic you wouldn't expect. We are indeed going to discuss carbon removal. To talk about this, I sit with Nan, who is the head of climate at Stripe and is also the head of Frontier. You're about to discover a woman truly dedicated to her mission. She tells us how Stripe has launched Frontier, aiming to purchase hundreds of millions of dollars in carbon removal between now and 2030. Together, we can go further. This is Nan's battle cry. We discuss how Frontier aims to address the challenges faced by the traditional offset market and improve measurement and verification methods for carbon removal. We delve into the concepts of pre-purchase and offtake agreements and understand the philosophy behind this initiative that is gathering more and more actors around it. Enjoy the show! Hello everyone. Hi Nan.
Hi.
It's great to have you here on Finscale, and this is the first time you join us, so it's wonderful for me to have such an important topic to discuss with you, climate and carbon removal, and I know it's a subject that is very important for you. Before diving deep into it, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Nan Ransohoff. I run climate at Stripe and also lead an AMC called Frontier.
Okay, and prior to Stripe, you have a great experience also in scale-ups like Uber, Neuro, and other great names like this?
Exactly. I spent a lot of my time, most of my career in the private sector, and most of that working on different pieces of the climate puzzle from companies like Opower and Nest and Uber, trying to get more people into fewer cars with Uber Pool. And so this is really sort of where my interest and passion lies around how do we decarbonize the global economy more quickly.
Okay, great. So as I said to you, it's the first time you join. It's also the first time that I'm also dealing with Stripe. And it was interesting for me to understand why there is such an importance for Stripe to move in the climate direction and carbon removal. So maybe before understanding Stripe Climate and Frontier, I would be interested to have your opinion and see what we need to do to tackle climate change. And can you talk about the need to reduce these emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere? So it's a wide question, but it's, I think, important for the audience.
It is. And, we've learned from scientists is that in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to get global emissions from around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalents every single year down to net zero by 2050. There are two main levers that we can pull. We can stop emitting in the first place, often called emissions reduction, or two, we can pull CO2 already in the atmosphere and ocean and store that somewhere permanently. The world is going to need to do a huge amount of both. Roughly the split, 90% of the effort should focus on emissions reduction. We will not solve climate change without attention on this piece. But because of the sort of, we've waited so long and because certain industries are quite hard to decarbonize, we will also, in addition to emissions reduction, need to do a lot of carbon removal. And we're particularly far behind on the second, in large part because most of the world didn't realize we were going to need to do as much as we now know we do until the 2018 IPCC report came out.
Mm-hmm. And what does carbon removal actually look like? Because we hear a lot of initiatives. Can you share with us some examples of technologies?
Carbon removal, is a phrase that encompasses a very broad and diverse set of technologies. I'll give you a couple examples. One is called direct air capture. They look like giant fans sucking in a bunch of air. They find the 412 particles of CO2 from the other million air particles, condense those, and then often inject them underground into, say, basalt, where it will mineralize once it gets down there. There's another company that's called Running Tide. This is growing kelp in the open ocean and sinking it. So, plants capture CO2 naturally through photosynthesis, and companies like Running Tide are taking advantage of the fact that, plants do this already for free, and then using storage at the bottom of the ocean, the proverbial desert floor of the ocean, to store that biomass. And then another example is a company called Charm Industrial. They are taking waste biomass like corn stover, which would otherwise re-emit the CO2 that the leaves had captured. They're pyrolyzing it. So they heat it up really quickly without oxygen, turn it into bio-oil, and then inject that bio-oil into oil wells to essentially put oil underground. These are just a couple of approaches that we're seeing. But what's really exciting is we're starting to see many more companies get started, and the diversity of those approaches continues to grow.
And what are the main challenges? I'm thinking of finding customers. And when we compare with other technologies, it seems less easy. Can you say a few words about that?
So the interesting thing about carbon removal is it doesn't have a natural customer. With something like energy, right? Humans use energy to do things, and there is a existing market for it. So even though solar or wind or nuclear might be expensive today, there is a world where if it can become cheap enough, there's an existing large market for it. With something like carbon removal, when you're sucking CO2 out of the air or ocean and storing it somewhere permanently where you can't use it, there is no natural customer because humans don't derive value from it. So part of the problem that carbon removal has had is, without customers, if you're an entrepreneur, why would you start a business that has no customers? If you were an investor, why would you invest in a business that is unlikely to have a revenue stream? So the lack of customers for carbon removal has been a real challenge. And as a result, there have been few companies that have gotten started. And the companies that have gotten started are really expensive because, with new technologies tend to be expensive when they get started. Tesla's expensive. The Roadster was expensive, right? But costs come down over time as they scale. And so effectively what we're, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure in detail, but effectively the crux of our theory of change is if we can provide a market signal that there will be customers for technologies that are at the early parts of their learning curve, then we can attract more founders to start the kinds of companies we need and investors to give the capital to help those companies actually get started and scale up.
So I've already interviewed founders of climate tech funds in Europe. Interesting to see that private funding can really support. Do you think that we can only rely on private funding, or there is a role to play also with government funding and actions, particularly to support all these initiatives?
It absolutely has to be both. We generally view, when it comes to carbon removal, the private sector as helping carbon removal get to first base. But in order for it to get all the way to where it needs to, it will absolutely need, significant public sector involvement. To sort of contextualize this from a market side, a demand side for carbon removal, by 2050, we will roughly need about 5 billion tons of removal a year. If we get the price down to $100 a ton, that is $500 billion per year of market demand that's needed. Global GDP is like $100 trillion. There's just no way that, it's very hard to imagine the private sector getting us to that kind of volume. But what we can do is help get these technologies to the point where when policy is actually in place, there are technologies that are ready to do the thing that the climate needs.
Okay, very, very interesting. And thank you for taking the time to go into such details. Now, I would be interested to dive into Stripe Climate. But prior to that, I would like to understand your role at Stripe. So head of climate is a new kind of position in corporates. So what it really means to be a head of climate at Stripe?
We're still evolving the role. It started, and it has evolved over the 3 years that I've been here. Up until last year, it was really focused on Stripe Climate, a product that helps users dedicate a portion of their revenue to carbon removal, which we pool together and use it to buy even more carbon removal down the cost curve in addition to our own funds. Last year, we started Frontier, which I now also lead. It's an advanced market commitment that we founded together with Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, and McKinsey Sustainability. So generally speaking, we think about our role as Stripe. I guess for context, Stripe builds financial infrastructure used by millions of businesses from, hyper-growth startups like Mano a Mano to global giants like La Redoute and Salesforce. And we do everything from accepting payments to moving money and managing complex businesses online. We are in the business of, at the end of the day, economic development and economic growth. And if you take a long enough view, climate change is one of the biggest threats to economic growth. And so this role, part of the genesis of this role was really thinking about how can we leverage our platform, how can we leverage our competencies to try and make a dent in some of the highest leverage parts of the climate puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the fact that you have a head of climate at Stripe diffused the climate culture? I don't know if we can talk about the climate culture within the team.
Climate is something that everybody is increasingly paying more and more attention to. It's just very hard to ignore at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that people of all generations are really starting to care quite deeply about. So I think we try to work in line with those values and reflect the values of sort of that general transition. In terms of emissions reduction, yes, we work with a company called Watershed who helps us measure our emissions, and then we've developed a emissions reduction strategy to run in parallel with our carbon removal strategy. Mm. So we do things like VPPAs for which are essentially virtual power purchase agreements for clean energy. We have been working to decarbonize our physical footprint in our buildings, working with our suppliers to help them, and managing our AWS emissions down as well. So there's a whole bucket of things that we're working on in addition to our carbon removal work.
Great to hear. Source of inspiration for the audience, I believe.
Lots to do.
Yeah. Okay, so if we now focus more on Frontier and Stripe Climate, can you explain to us how the initiative started and what was the vision in the beginning and how it evolved?
I think it's useful to contextualize this in a bit of the history. So back in 2019, Stripe started buying carbon removal in response to the 2018 IPCC report. At the time, it was $1 million to buy permanent carbon removal from companies that are really small today and really expensive today, but have the potential to be very low cost and high volume in the future. When we did that, when we announced our initial purchases from 4 companies, we actually got a huge amount of outreach from Stripe users saying, hey, we've wanted to do something for a while in climate, but it's hard to figure out what to do, and we have a lot of other things to do. If we send you money, could you figure out what to do with it? And it was that insight that basically pushed us to start Stripe Climate. As I mentioned, Stripe Climate is a really easy way for any business, any Stripe business, to contribute a fraction of their revenue to carbon removal, which we pool together and use it to buy carbon removal in addition to our own funds. So that got us from $1 million to tens of millions of dollars. And there are actually, tens of thousands of businesses contributing to Stripe Climate. So, roughly a year and a half, 2 years ago, we got in a room and we said, okay, well, I guess it was a little bit more than that, 2+ years ago, we got in a room and said, on the one hand, this field has made a lot of progress over the past couple of years. On the other hand, we're still extremely far behind where we need to be relative to global climate targets. And so we came up with a bunch of ideas, we killed a bunch of ideas. And one of the ideas that we couldn't kill is this idea of an advanced market commitment. And we can talk more about what that is specifically, but effectively, this came from a need of us realizing that, no single business is going to be able to build the necessary market for carbon removal because the scale is just so huge. And so we essentially went out and looked for companies that both shared our vision to be early buyers of promising solution, regardless of price, and that we're willing and able to move fast. And we found Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, and McKinsey Sustainability, and we pooled now over $1 billion to buy permanent carbon removal from really promising early stage companies between now and 2030.
And how did you convince such companies, Alphabet, the one you mentioned, Meta?
All the companies that we co-founded this with have ambitious climate programs, and they understand technology cost curves, and they have their own net zero commitments that they are ultimately going to use carbon removal against, in addition to many other emissions reductions initiatives that they're working on. So, I think this actually fits. If you're a company and you make a net zero commitment, part of that net zero commitment, in addition to emissions reductions, is carbon removal. And the problem with carbon removal is there isn't enough permanent supply that exists today. So the options are basically are limited. In order for companies to have confidence that they can meet their own net zero commitments, we have to pull new supply into existence. We cannot just purchase and trade the existing supply that already exists today. And so the companies that we co-founded with really saw this problem and said, okay, how can I actually help explicitly pull in new supply rather than just compete over what exists today.
Mm. And why did you establish Frontier as a public benefit LLC instead of a non-profit organization?
For clarity, Frontier, neither Frontier nor Stripe makes a profit off of these activities. It's a bit of a wonky reason. So structurally, Frontier facilitates purchases between buyers and sellers. So we don't actually have funds flowing through Frontier. And so public benefit LLC is administratively easier to run. And because we don't need the tax deductibility benefits of a 501c3, this was the sort of better choice for our structure.
Okay. And when you set the goal, do you have the idea of expanding the supply of carbon removal? And what are the goals in that sense?
Frontier's goal is to put carbon removal on its best possible trajectory towards that 6 billion tons per year that we need by 2050. For context, there's only 10,000 tons of carbon removal that have been removed to date. In the short term, that means, so we sort of take the long view and the short view. In the short term, we're really trying to work to get 1 million tons of carbon removal permanent carbon removal responsibly deployed and rigorously measured by 2026. So, all of the things that we're doing at Frontier and all the money coming into the space, all of these are creating the conditions for the thing that actually needs to happen, which is removing tons of CO2 from the air and ocean and storing them permanently. That is ultimately the thing that the climate cares about. So we want to make sure that, the work that we're doing on the buy side is actually translating into the thing that the climate needs. And the numbers will be small initially, and they will grow over time, as is the case with any new technologies. To get there, Frontier has a 2-track mechanism for purchases. We make pre-purchases to help get more companies to the starting line. Mm-hmm. These are smaller purchases for really early stage companies that are promising, but usually at bench scale. Most of our funds will actually be spent through offtakes. Offtakes are contracts that are pay upon delivery. Mm-hmm. They allow carbon removal companies to essentially take this promise that a buyer has made to buy a certain number of tons at a certain price to a bank and help them get financing to build their next facility. Mm-hmm. And this is the in terms of dollar volume, where most of our funds will actually be spent. But we're, effectively playing the role of the buyer to help pull more supply into existence in the near term, and then hopefully continue growing that into the long term.
Okay, you mentioned 2 words that I maybe you should clarify for the audience, because you mentioned pre-purchases and offtake agreements. Can you please elaborate a little bit on this, just to clarify? Sure.
So the pre-purchase track is intended for really early stage companies that are just getting started. We've actually been we're now on our 6th round of pre-purchases, where essentially we are getting applications from companies doing a very wide variety of things. We evaluate those applications with, the help of our 5 PhDs internally, and then, more than 50 experts externally to to make decisions, but we are paying companies usually around $500,000 today to remove tons in the future. And if they don't remove those tons, we're not going to claw the money back. It's sort of a low, like a generous revenue, so to speak. Offtakes, on the other hand, are for companies that are just getting ready to start to scale. Mm-hmm. And they're typically larger in volume. So we just wrote an offtake to Charm Industrial for $53 million to remove 112,000 tons over 9 years. And these are structurally different in that the buyer only pays the supplier when the supplier has delivered tons. Mm-hmm. And what's nice about this for a buyer is that it de-risks that purchase. We're not paying money out today with the risk of not getting the thing that we bought back in return. It's great for the supplier because, as I mentioned, they can take the offtake and get bank financing with it in many cases. And what's interesting about these offtakes is, there is huge value in the commitment to buy carbon removal even before cash changes hands. This is a concept that we took from the energy sector. Mm-hmm. This was how one of the ways that clean energy got cheap, started to get cheap back in the 90s. Google actually structured some really interesting PPAs, they were called power purchase agreements, to essentially pay a premium for a solar plant, for example, that was producing energy at a premium to what the market was paying. And it's the same concept that we've borrowed and applied to carbon removal.
Okay. Is there a way for new companies to join the initiatives? Because you mentioned just a few of them, but I believe that many more companies will be interested to join you.
Yes, we actually announced another $125 million committed to Frontier just a couple months ago. So we're looking for new partners all the time. We generally think about our work on both the demand and the supply side. And on the demand side, $1 billion over 9 years is both a small and big step, depending on the lens that you view it through. When Frontier was launched, $1 billion was 30 times what had been spent cumulatively on carbon removal, as of the end of 2021, which is wild. And so while $1 billion is a great initial start, we are absolutely looking to continue to grow that so that we can support this growing ecosystem.
Okay. And another question that is not linked with Frontier. So I don't know if Stripe as a corporate venture arm, but is the objective also to invest Stripe as investor in climate-related projects or companies?
We're really focused on being the buyer to try to pull more companies to the starting line and help them scale up. Mm-hmm. But again, this is currently not in a way that generates profit for Stripe, and that's really not the intention.
Okay. So what are your next steps at Frontier?
Right now, we are heads down reviewing pre-purchase applications. We actually got the largest batch of companies ever in our 6 rounds, and we're getting ready for our next round of offtake agreements. So we're really focused on, at a high level, 2 things. 1, raising more money for the field, and 2, spending those dollars as effectively as possible through purchases so that we can help the most promising companies get down the cost curve and scale up.
Great. Good luck.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Nan. And thank you very much, Florian, in this, for making it happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening and sharing this moment with us. Don't hesitate to contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn to share your comments and reactions. You can also rate this episode on your favorite podcast platform. See you soon.